Hey guys, I'm Alex, you're watching Auto Buyer's Guide, and this is the biggest EV at the Ford dealership. It's the 2025 e-Transit, and for $51,000, one of these could be yours. But do you or your small or medium-sized business want one? Now, before we get stuck into the e-Transit, it's important to know that if you are a business, you will get the $7,500 tax credit. Well, not if you're a business. If you run a business or own a business, your business will get a $7,500 tax credit, even though a private citizen buying one would not. And that's because the corporate tax credit structure for EVs is different and doesn't have the same requirements as regular EV tax credits. That's important because it does lower the effective price of the Transit below the $50,000 mark, and actually a lot closer, but not the same as a regular Ford Transit. On the other hand, though, you might have lower operating costs and some other benefits depending on exactly where you're operating your van. So what is the e-Transit? Well, it's basically a regular transit body on top of a unique frame designed specifically for the electric model. It's focused mainly at delivery and other service businesses that have daily drives of maybe 75 miles to 100 miles. Ford says that the average commercial van, and trust me, they know a lot about commercial van statistics, drives around 74 miles each day. So regardless of the e-Transit you get, the battery range should be appropriate. The only major change to the outside is right here because the charging door is in the nose. I do find that a lot easier to deal with, especially public charging, because you can actually charge this at a Tesla supercharger station, by the way, and that means that you will actually be able to plug it in without occupying, I mean, you're still going to occupy a lot of space, but you will occupy one parking space, theoretically, with your e-Transit at the supercharger. As with the rest of the Transit lineup, there are a number of different ways to get the e-Transit. There are currently 2 different lengths, one wheelbase if we're talking about the regular van version, and 3 different roof heights, long, medium, and high. But you can also get a chassis cab or a cutaway version if you want to have the biggest van around. You could do your own conversion, etc. But based on the range figures, you're probably not going to want to do that. It's important to remember that we don't have official range estimates by the EPA for vehicles of this size and this weight class. So all the numbers that we have are estimates from Ford. There are 2 different battery packs available. The e-Transit started with a 68 kilowatt hour battery pack. They realized maybe some customers wanted a bit of extra cushion there, so they now give it an 89.9 kilowatt hour battery pack, but oddly enough, the short models can actually have both. So if we're not talking about the extended van version, you can actually have the small battery if you want. It's a no-cost option apparently. And the main reason you might want to get that is because it ups the payload capacity by about 400 pounds. The van will top out at around 4,000 pounds of payload. Of course, the cutaways and the chassis cabs, they're going to have range figures based on whatever you stick behind the cab, because that could be a really big box, it could be a flatbed, whatever. All of that is going to affect its effective range. All models, however, will have the same motor in the back, 266 horsepower, 312 pound-feet of torque. If you get the base battery pack, bearing in mind you cannot mate that with the extended body, you'll get between 108 and 126 miles of Ford-rated range. If you get the higher capacity battery like we have in here, it's going to be between 159 miles and 143 miles. So definitely okay for the average commute for the average commercial vehicle. Also solidly okay is the AC charge rate, because we now have an available onboard dual charger that will allow this to accept up to 80 amps and drop the charge time down to just 6 hours at 208 volts, which is the voltage you'll find in most commercial installations. If you want a DC fast charge, that's 176 kilowatts peak, but I don't think you're really going to want to do that or have your employees do that, because every hour they spend at a charger is an hour they're not doing their job, they're not making the van productive, and then of course you're still paying them. And that's actually a bigger consideration than I think some people would think, because last week when I was charging something else, there was actually a Ford Transit van at the EVgo station, and it was there for quite some time as the driver was just playing on his phone. At any rate, back here we have the barn door arrangement in this particular van. Again, there are different formats available with the chassis cabs and cutaways, etc. You can, of course, wrap the doors all the way around to the side. That's kind of a nice touch. We have a relatively high floor in here, but That's not really down to the battery and electric motor because Ford has redesigned the rear suspension along with the frame to accommodate that motor in the rear. This now has an independent suspension in the back. It also has, courtesy of the EV system, 2.4 kilowatts of onboard inversion available via this power outlet or one up front. Now, I have to say, I am surprised that we don't have more power output capability. They didn't borrow the full power offboard experience that we find in the Lightning. At least for the moment. Who knows what the future holds, of course. The model we're driving today is a mid-roof version, so you can see the ceiling is not quite 6 feet tall there. We also have a manual sliding door, cargo tie-downs, and basically a very similar option set to the regular Transit lineup. And that includes not just things like cargo dividers, etc., but also the suite of Ford software for the e-Transit. Because like the rest of Ford's lineup, this has internet connectivity built into its infotainment system and the basic core software of the vehicle. That allows vehicle tracking, usage tracking, all that jazz, but also charging tracking. So if, for instance, you have people that take their vans home at night and you want them to charge at home because that's where charging makes the most sense, again, that whole time at the charger problem, you can actually monitor their charging fleet-wide, and you can automatically have it calculate reimbursements for the cost of their charging at home. So if you don't have a lot of infrastructure at the office for charging and your employees take their vans home anyway, of course, caveat there, your employees have to live somewhere where they could charge. How likely is that? I don't know. But it is possible with Ford's telematics software. And then of course you have all the usual Ford stuff, the integration for monitoring other things, not just the van. So if you have other integrations into the vehicle, some of those can be integrated with that Ford telematics system, for a price, of course. Let's check out the interior now, starting with the seats. I hope your drivers are all one size because this seat is not as adjustable. I'm moving it close to the steering wheel so you can see the seat there since the doors don't open terribly wide. The seat has a two-way adjustable lumbar, manual, and a reclining seat back. It also slides forward and backward, but importantly, it does not go up and down. So if you have a fleet of people that are about 6 feet tall or over, this is going to be really comfortable. If you have a lot of shorter drivers, you might want to take a look at something else. Since this is the mid-roof model, we can check out the interior while standing up. Over there on the driver's side, we have lots of different storage cubbies. We have a cup holder up there on the dashboard, storage cubby below that. We then have more storage running right across the dashboard, including a 12-volt power port, USB-C charge port in that area. Actually, sorry, USB-C interface port for the system. Running across the dashboard, more of that storage going on right there. The passenger gets their own cup holder and their own storage bin in the dashboard. We have a bin-style glove compartment, if I could get over there. You can see we could fit a tablet computer in there, no problem. This model, let's check it out, is $67,035, just in case you were wondering. More storage going on the front doors. You can see the rubber mat that kind of covers that hump in the middle. And then speaking of humps, we have this really weird bump that contains the shifter for the vehicle. We have low, just like we have in a Mach-E, so that's more aggressive regen braking, USB-A interface for the system, 12-volt power port, and then basically the same software that we find in the Mach-E, including EV routing via the onboard mapping. There are a few apps that are available for the system. It supports Apple CarPlay and Android Auto. And the only place you'll find climate controls are right here in the infotainment touchscreen system. Now, one interesting touch is that it does support EV routing with Apple CarPlay. That's something that Apple and Ford have been working on together for a while. Down below, we find the power volume knob. We have a drive mode selector. Don't worry, even though it has a flag, we don't have a sport mode. It's just normal, eco, and slippery. We then have the defroster, camera button right there because we do have a 360-degree camera system on this vehicle, in addition to the rear view mirror camera. Back over on the driver's side, we have an analog instrument cluster, which is really kind of an oddity for an electric vehicle. We have a power and charge gauge over there on the left, but the most important gauge, I would say, is actually down here in the middle. It's this maximum power gauge. That is telling you how much power is available at the moment. And if you are climbing up steep hills, you'll notice that it will no longer be in that max power range. It's actually going to be down there one line below. That may not sound like too big of a deal at first, but there is a pretty noticeable difference in the PEP. We have volume and track forward-backward controls split on either side of the steering wheel, controls for the cruise control over there, and controls for that instrument cluster on the right. I'm not sure that driving dynamics are a top priority for the average commercial van shopper, but let's talk about them anyway. This model went 0 to 60 in 8.2 seconds when it was empty. That's actually not a bad showing for a van like this. Bear in mind that a regular Transit with the regular V6 engine that comes in the base model is not going to be any quicker than this 0 to 60. In our 60 to 0 stopping test, it took 138 feet for this to stop. You can thank the battery pack and, of course, the relatively skinny tires for that longer stopping distance. But all that's practically in line with just about all the van competition. Whether we're talking about this, or the ProMaster, or the Mercedes vans, they're all right there in the same range. While we're talking about braking, it's important to remember that this has only one electric motor, and it's back there on the rear axle. That does mean that when regen braking is called upon, whether we're in the drive mode or the low mode for enhanced regen, all of it's happening on the rear axle. And if you're on ice or snow or just a slippery, steep road, especially when the back end is empty, you will definitely notice that there's a lack of grip back there for the aggressive regen, especially in that L mode. The system then has to dial back the regen and then start engaging friction brakes if your foot's on the brake pedal. If your foot's not on the brake pedal and it's just in L, then the system sort of gives up and it feels more like you're in neutral going down a hill. That's not unique to the E-Transit. That will happen in just about every rear-wheel drive EV. It's definitely something that we've noticed, for instance, in our long-term Volvo EX30, because even though it has a front electric motor, it's doing most of the regen on the back. That's one of the reasons why I kind of wish that Ford had given this a second motor, maybe a small, little tiny front motor for improved traction. It would be nice to have just a little bit better traction, especially for people that want to have a cargo van like this in areas that get regular snow. It would certainly make traction a lot better. Even if it wasn't a big motor, it could be 70 horsepower or so, just one of those small motors from something else. I think that would be a great feature to add to the E-Transit. It would also improve the regenerative braking feel because it could move that regeneration to the front axle where you logically want most of the braking to be happening. As far as the rest of the driving dynamics go, there's not too much to talk about. It drives like a big boxy van, albeit one with a little bit more weight than the average gasoline-powered van. The turning radius is actually pretty respectable. I was surprised how tight this turns given its size. So navigating narrower roads like this or urban areas is not going to be that much different than a shorter full-size van, I would say. Turning radius is pretty consistent with something like the Sprinter. The e-Sprinter, of course, because that's certainly a direct competitor to this. For me at least, one of the most surprising things about the E-Transit is that Ford decided not to use a solid axle in the back, because they do make electric solid axles for heavy-duty vehicles. Ford instead decided to develop the first, according to them, the first heavy-duty commercial independent suspension in the back. And it does show. Even though this van is completely unloaded at the moment, the ride quality is reasonably good. This is probably the best riding cargo van that I've ever driven. It certainly is the only independent suspension cargo van I've ever driven. On this rougher road surface with lots of potholes and water diversion channels, etc., the suspension does a good job of not getting upset in the rear or really being too crashy like some cargo vans can. On the cabin noise front, 75 decibels is what I got in here at 50 miles an hour. Bear in mind, obviously, it's a completely empty box back there, so the actual sound level is just going to be dependent on what kind of things you've tossed in the back, what kind of shelves you have there, clanking around, etc. Also, your fuel economy is going to depend on the kind of driving you do and how loaded up your van is, but you shouldn't expect fantastic fuel economy with something with a roof this high. And indeed, we have not been getting fantastic fuel economy. This has been averaging 1.4 to 1.5 miles per kilowatt hour over this week. That's about what I expected it to get, to be perfectly honest. Again, big tall roof. The cost to operate is logically going to depend on what you pay for electricity in your area. That could be lower than gasoline, or it could be almost on par with gasoline, depending on exactly where you are in America. Oddly enough, I've driven a decent number of big cargo vans in my life, and this just feels like another big cargo van. That's probably what's going to make it so easy to integrate into your fleet. On the other hand, we don't have a traditional transmission to worry about shifting, so the driving nature is certainly smoother. It's not any quieter, really, than the average van out there. It doesn't really stop any shorter or any longer than most of the competition, but it does ride a little bit better. So if you're worried about worker comfort, something like that, you might want to check this out because of the independent suspension over some of those other electric vans that don't have that feature. Before we get to pricing, there are a few more things we should talk about. The first one is we do have a 75 mile per hour factory limiter on the van. Factory limiters can typically be adjusted via your Ford dealer, so if you want your fleet to be adjusted down from there, you can probably do that at the Ford dealer. I doubt it could be adjusted up, however. The other thing we should talk about is that power gauge there. In regular driving, even on this hill going up the hill, I didn't find myself having a power derating. But climbing Highway 17, which is the highway that goes from Santa Cruz to San Jose in California, on that slope, which goes up and over a 2,200-foot mountain pass, about 3/4 of the way up, I did notice that we entered that power limiting zone. Because on that road surface, to climb the hill, especially with anything in the back, we had about 1,000 pounds of stuff in the back just to test it out. Now, it had no problem keeping up with traffic on that hill, but if, for instance, you wanted to pass a slow car, or traffic slowed down and then started freeing up in front of you, you would definitely notice the power restriction. Final pricing on the e-Transit is going to depend on your tax situation or your company's tax situation and whether or not you have the fleet discount program. Because Ford, like every other company that makes commercial vehicles in the US, has a volume fleet discount program. If you buy a certain number of vehicles from them a year, you get a discount on most of their lineup, and this is included in that fleet discount program. But the base MSRP starts at $53,095. That includes the destination charge, which is just over $2,000. That is more expensive than the 3.5-liter V6 equipped regular Transit at $49,495. But remember, companies get a clean vehicle tax credit that's different than the one that regular consumers get. So not everybody out there will qualify for a tax credit on a regular EV, but companies will qualify for a tax credit on just about any EV. The key thing there, of course, is your company has to pay taxes, because if your company is wrapped up in some different kind of reporting structure where it doesn't pay taxes directly, etc., it may not be useful. Also, a lot of companies end up leasing vehicles. That's another thing to keep in mind. So if you're doing a fleet lease, then some of these details are going to depend more on how that lease program wraps that tax credit into things, or whether they will at all. But if you qualify for it, it could get this down to $45,595, which is actually less expensive than the base V6 equipped Transit. And any way you slice it, this is less expensive than the most direct competition in the US, which is the eSprinter or the ProMaster EV. The eSprinter now has a small battery pack available. The only battery pack previously was a bigger battery pack than even the big battery pack in this one. Now it has a small pack available that will give you about 173 miles of range, but it's going to be about $10,000 more expensive than the e-Transit. The ProMaster EV, it's more expensive than that at $78,000 approximately starting. That has a pretty decently sized battery pack, but oddly enough, it's not as efficient as the e-Transit, or their estimates are just off, because remember, we're not talking about EPA certified range here. According to RAM, that one's good for about 170 miles. So kind of in the same range as this e-Transit. If you're looking for an electric van value, you definitely should look at the e-Transit. There's definitely a lot of good reasons to get this. We don't know exactly how durable the motor and battery pack will be, but generally speaking, motors and batteries are pretty reliable. So I would bet that this battery pack and this motor would last longer than the traditional engine and transmission combos in fleet vehicles. If you're familiar with fleet operations, it's not uncommon to replace an engine or a transmission in just about every vehicle in your fleet before 100,000 miles or so, depending on the kind of duty that the vehicles are doing and how much weight is being carried inside. Depending on where you are in the United States, there may also be some additional state and local incentives to help get fleets into electric vehicles like this, and then the cost of operation is likely going to be lower in most of the US based on the average electric rate, although that will depend on exactly how much electricity costs in your area. In my neck of the woods in Northern California, in the Bay Area, this may actually be a little bit more expensive than some alternatives, especially some more efficient gasoline alternatives out there. And lastly, keep in mind that if you are doing a lot of driving, or your fleet is doing a lot of driving, you are going to be spending more time charging, especially DC fast charging your van. And that is a consideration worth bearing in mind. If your daily delivery routes or daily routes, whatever your business is doing with a van like this, would involve more than about 120, 130 miles on a regular basis, I probably would steer away from something like this, because it does mean that your fleet is probably going to have to stop to charge at least some point during the day. And I don't know about you, but the thought of having late deliveries or lots of overtime on a regular basis, or just the inconvenience to employees of not being able to get off from an 8-hour shift in 8 hours because they had to spend an hour charging their van, and now the deliveries are late, they're late back home, etc. That's probably too tricky to contend with. But Ford does remind us all that the average fleet vehicle only drives about 75 miles a day. So if your fleet is solidly average, absolutely, e-Transit would work for you. Let me know what you think about all that down there in the comments section below. And would you love to see Ford create some sort of crazy extra long-range e-Transit? I would love to see Ford put a range extender under the hood of the e-Transit, because how cool would it be to have maybe some sort of 2-liter 4-cylinder turbo engine under there and a generator, and then turn the e-Transit into one of the ultimate camper vans out there. Add a little electric motor or maybe some way for that gasoline engine to drive the front wheels, and you could have an interesting sort of alternative to maybe an Airstream. There are not very many options in that particular space in the US. Let me know about that as well down there. See all of you later.